A silk dress can hide a recording wire just as easily as it hides a knife. In the Meridian Hotel's top-floor private dining suite, where the city's most untouchable men came to eat and drink and speak with the kind of reckless confidence that only comes from years of absolute immunity, the person who heard everything was the one nobody thought to silence. She was the accountant. 31 years old, 260 pounds of meticulous, invisible precision. She sat at a small folding table in the corner with a laptop and a leather binder, and the men at the long mahogany table spoke freely in front of her, the way people speak freely in front of furniture. Her name was Elise Navarro, and on a wet Thursday night in November, she became the most important person in the room. The Meridian's 42nd floor was not a place civilians ate dinner. It didn't appear on any hotel menu. There was no elevator button for it, no signage, no staff who would acknowledge it existed. Access required a private key card issued through a shell company registered in Delaware, and the suite itself had been reserved for the evening under the name of a defunct textile importer that had ceased operations in 2011. The man who actually held the reservation was seated at the head of the table. Vincent Ma. Ma was 51 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular stillness that comes not from peace, but from the knowledge that violence is always available if stillness fails. He ran what the FBI publicly called the Mar Organization, and what everyone in his world simply called the company, a network of port contracts, construction fronts, political influence, and enforcement that stretched from New Orleans up through Atlanta and into the underbelly of New York. He had never been convicted of anything. He had twice been indicted and twice watched the cases collapse before trial. A coincidence his enemies had stopped finding amusing. Elise worked for Mare's legitimate side, or what passed for it. Specifically, she worked for Halston Properties, one of Mare's real estate holding companies, where her official title was Senior Financial Analyst, and her actual job was to make numbers that shouldn't add up look like they did. She was not naive about what she handled. She knew where the money came from. She told herself the same thing she suspected most people in her position told themselves. That the alternative was worse. That she kept her head down. That she didn't ask questions she didn't need answered. She was very good at not asking questions. She was also very good at hearing everything. That was the thing about being a plus-size woman in a room full of powerful men. They saw the laptop. They saw the binder. They saw a functionary, a number cruncher, someone whose purpose was to be useful and whose presence was to be ignored. They did not see someone with a graduate degree in forensic accounting, someone who had spent 10 years reading the small print that other people waved away. Someone who could reconstruct an entire financial conspiracy from a single mismatched line item. Elise Navarro had learned very early in her career that the fastest way to become invisible was to look exactly like what people already expected to see. She was invisible the night the man sitting across from Ma slid a folder across the mahogany table and said, "The shipment clears Port of New Orleans Monday. Your cut lands in the Cayman account by Wednesday. All you have to do is make sure Kellerman keeps his mouth shut until then." The man's name was Frank Osei. He was Mare's chief operating officer, a role that sounded legitimate until you understood that his primary function was to serve as the bridge between Mare's legitimate businesses and the people those businesses existed to launder money for. Osei was 10 years younger than Mare, quicker, more restless, and in the past 6 months he had begun wearing a specific brand of watch. A platinum Lang & Söhne, retailing at around $115,000 that did not appear in his salary records. Elise had noticed this 3 months ago. She had filed the observation away in the back of her mind, next to several others she had collected with the quiet, compulsive diligence of a person who cannot stop noticing things. "Kellerman isn't a concern," Mare said, cutting into his steak. His voice had that quality that made every statement sound like it had already been settled. "Kellerman," Understands his position. Good. Osi smiled. Then we're aligned. Elise's fingers moved over the keyboard. She was supposed to be logging adjustments to a Q4 reconciliation. Instead, she was sitting very still because something was wrong and she was trying to figure out what. It wasn't the conversation. She had heard worse. It was Osi. Specifically, it was the way Osi kept glancing at his phone, setting it face up on the table, which he never did, then flipping it face down again, then checking it a third time with a motion so practiced it was clearly meant to look casual. It was the way he had arrived 12 minutes late, which Mare hated, without offering any explanation. It was the thin crease between his eyebrows when Mare said the name Kellerman. A crease that wasn't confusion or boredom, but something that looked, to Elise's very trained eye, like relief. Relief at the wrong moment. Relief at a name he supposedly hadn't been thinking about. She looked slowly around the room. There were 4 other men at the table, Mare's senior lieutenants, all occupied with their food and their drinks. 2 of Mare's personal security detail stood near the door, big, competent, focused outward, which was their job and also their blind spot. A waiter moved quietly along the perimeter refilling glasses, and Elise, in her corner, with her laptop and her binder, she looked back at Osi. He had set his phone face up again, and this time when a message came in, she caught the preview on the screen from 15 feet away. She had excellent eyesight. Always had. 2 words, almost there. The crease between Osi's brows disappeared. In its place came the very faint, involuntary relaxation of someone who has been waiting and has just received confirmation that the wait is nearly over. He picked up his wine glass and leaned back in his chair with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided he no longer needs to be careful. Elise's pulse did something slow and strange in her chest. She knew what almost there meant when a man at a mobster's dinner table looked like that after reading it. It wasn't a food delivery notification. She looked at the door, then at the windows. The 42nd floor. Mare's security was outside the suite, not inside the building's stairwells. She thought about the private elevator, the key card. Who else might have access to that card if they knew who to ask or how much to offer? She thought about the platinum watch that didn't appear in any salary record. She thought about 6 months of small, quietly filed observations and what they looked like when you laid them all next to each other. Frank Osi was being paid by someone who wanted Vincent Mare dead. And whoever they were almost there. Elise's hands had gone completely still on the keyboard. She was not a brave person. She would have been the first to say so. She was someone who had built her entire professional existence around the act of not being noticed, not being involved, not being the one who had to make a call. She was very good at keeping her head down. She had kept her head down so consistently and so completely that she sometimes wasn't sure there was anything underneath it worth lifting up. But Vincent Ma had said thank you to her once. It was 3 years ago, at a quarterly review meeting, after she had flagged an error in a property valuation that would have cost one of his holding companies $2.5 million. It was her job to catch errors. She had expected nothing. Instead, Mar had looked at her across the conference table and said, simply and directly, "Good catch, Miss Navarro. Thank you." Not in the distracted, reflexive way that men in his position usually acknowledged service. He had looked at her like she was a person. She had thought about that for longer than made any rational sense. And 2 months after that, she had heard him, in a phone call she wasn't supposed to be near, tell his property manager to give the maintenance crew a paid day off with full wages after a pipe burst at one of the buildings, and they'd spent 14 hours in the water. He hadn't announced it. No one was supposed to know. He had just done it. He was not a good man. She knew that with complete clarity, but he was something more complicated than purely monstrous. And she was not going to sit in the corner with her laptop and watch Frank Osi collect a payout for his murder. She had exactly one option that didn't involve screaming or running, both of which would accelerate whatever was coming. She tore a page from the back of her legal pad with the slow, quiet deliberateness of someone who does everything slowly and quietly. She uncapped the pen that lived permanently in the breast pocket of her blazer. The blazer was a deep wine red, custom-tailored to fit her correctly, which had taken 3 tries and was worth every attempt. She pressed the pen to the paper. She wrote, "OC, phone, almost there. Watch his hands. You have maybe 4 minutes." She folded the page twice. Small, the size of a business card. She closed her laptop, stacked it on the binder, and stood up. She walked to the table with the quiet, unhurried gravity she had spent a decade perfecting. The walk of a woman who is simply doing her job, who belongs here, who's not alarmed, who is, in fact, entirely not worth watching. She approached Mara's end of the table. She picked up the near-empty water pitcher that sat on a tray beside his seat. "Mr. Ma," she said, her voice smooth and low, "I have the updated Q4 projections if you'd like them before you finish dinner." Ma looked up from his plate. His dark eyes tracked to her face with that unhurried precision that she had long understood was actually a form of threat assessment. Everyone who approached him was assessed, always. She looked back at him steadily. She had practiced being steady her entire life. She poured the water, and as she set the pitcher back on the tray, she slid the folded paper under the base of his wine glass with the pad of her thumb, pressing it there for exactly 1 second, and then withdrawing her hand. His eyes dropped to the glass, then back to her face. Elise held his gaze for 2 full seconds, enough to communicate intent, not so long as to communicate panic, and then she turned and walked back to her corner table. She did not look at OC. She did not look at the door. She sat down, reopened her laptop, and stared at the screen, and her heart was hammering so hard she was surprised it wasn't audible. She counted seconds. Vincent Mayer was not the kind of man who had survived this long by being slow. She knew that about him too. At 7 seconds, she saw him reach for his wine glass in her peripheral vision. He brought it to his lips, set it down, and as he did, his other hand moved to the tablecloth and the paper was gone. He palmed it with the ease of a card player, and under the table, out of sight, he read it. She didn't look directly at him. She watched his reflection in the darkened window across the room, the 42nd floor, giving her the entire city as a backdrop. At 18 seconds, the line of Mare's shoulders changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would read to an observer as alarm. He simply settled back very slightly, the way a person does when they have shifted from one mode of operation to another. From dinner guest to something older and much colder. He did not reach for a phone. He did not look at Ose. He picked up his steak knife, cut a precise bite from the ribeye on his plate, and chewed it. Then he set the knife down parallel to the fork, a habit she had noticed him doing every meal when he was thinking. And he said conversationally to the man beside him, "Tanner, how did the Covington appraisal come back?" Tanner, a lieutenant named Wallace Tanner, who had been with Mare for 15 years, blinked at the change of subject and said, "Came back clean. 4-2. Good." Ma reached for his wine again. He took a long sip, and then, setting the glass down very softly, he looked at Frank Osi. It was the first time he had looked directly at Osi since Elise handed him the note. And the look was not accusatory. It was not angry. It was the specific emptiness of a man who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to implement it. Ose had no idea. He was checking his phone again, the face-up flip, and his wine glass was nearly empty, and there was a very particular quality to his stillness that Elise recognized as the stillness of someone listening for something. "Frank," Mara said pleasantly, "tell me something. Have you heard from DeMarco recently? He's been quiet." Osi looked up. "DeMarco? No, not in a few weeks. Why? Curious." Mara swirled his wine. "He came up in a conversation I had this afternoon, something about a restructuring arrangement, a cash out. He paused just long enough. You wouldn't know anything about that. It wasn't a question. The lack of question mark was a weapon, and O.C. walked directly into it. His hands went completely still on the table. A fraction of a second's delay, maybe a little more, before he said, "No, I don't know what you're referring to." Ma nodded as if this was perfectly satisfactory. It doesn't matter. But his hand had moved below the table, a gesture so small that Elise almost missed it. 2 fingers extended briefly toward Wallace Tanner on his left. Tanner, who had been with him 15 years and presumably knew every signal he had ever developed, straightened almost imperceptibly in his chair. At the door, the 2 security men did not move, but the quality of their stillness changed. O.C.'s phone buzzed, face up this time, no flipping. He grabbed it, and Elise could see from across the room that whatever message had arrived was not the one he had been waiting for. His pupils dilated. The color in his face shifted. "I need to make a call," O.C. said, starting to push back from the table. "Please," Mara said, "finish your dinner first." The gentleness of it was terrifying. O.C. looked at Ma and seemed, for the first time all evening, to understand that the dynamic in the room had shifted. He looked at the door, at Tanner, at his phone. He looked everywhere except at the woman in the corner in the wine-red blazer. He never had. That was the entire problem. What happened next was fast and surgical and very quiet. Tanner stood. One of the men by the door stepped inside and closed it. Ma set his wine glass down with a precise, final click, and in the silence that followed, Frank O.C. made a sound like a man who has just understood all at once. Every mistake he made and in what order he made them. Elise kept her eyes on her laptop screen. The numbers in the spreadsheet blurred and cleared. She breathed carefully through her nose. A long minute passed, and then another, and the dinner table held a conversation that she could not fully hear, and that she did not want to fully hear. And then Tanner walked O.C. out of the room, with a hand at his elbow that looked polite from a distance. The door closed. Ma sat at the head of the table for a moment in absolute stillness. Then he looked up, and across the length of the room, his eyes found her. The other lieutenants hadn't moved. They were watching their plates, or their wine, with the practiced incuriosity of men who had learned not to see things they weren't invited to see. But Ma was looking at Elise, and his expression was something she had no filing system for. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise. Something more fundamental, the look of a man who has been handed something genuinely unexpected by a genuinely unexpected source. He said nothing. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and then he inclined his head very slightly, a small, private acknowledgement, and turned back to his table. Elise's hands had started shaking. She pressed them flat against the keyboard and waited for them to stop. It took 3 days before anyone came. She had expected it would be immediate. That night or the next morning, men at her door, a car outside her building. She had spent the first 48 hours in a state of coiled, sleepless dread, jumping at her own refrigerator, jumping at her phone, jumping at shadows on the wall of her apartment. She had gone through every version of the conversation she might have to have with a police detective, had rehearsed the look of a person who had simply been doing her job and had seen and heard nothing of consequence. She had also eaten a great deal of Thai takeout, because anxiety required fuel, and gone over the Holston Properties books 3 times, looking for anything that might suggest who O.C. had been working with, and whether they were going to be a problem. On the 3rd day, at a little past 7 in the evening, she was walking back from the dry cleaners with her work blazer in a plastic bag when a black Suburban with dark-tinted windows pulled to the curb in front of her building. Her whole body went ice-cold. The passenger door opened. A man stepped out. He was probably 40 compact and carefully dressed in a charcoal suit with no tie, and he held himself with the specific economy of movement that Elise associated with people who had spent time being dangerous professionally. "Mrs. Navarro," he said. "My name is Callum. Mr." Mara would like a few minutes of your time." Elise looked at the Suburban, looked at Callum, looked at the dry cleaner's bag in her hand, which seemed briefly like a very normal thing to be holding at the beginning of something that was not going to be normal. "Where?" she said. "His home, about 40 minutes outside the city. Is this optional?" Callum considered this honestly. "Mr. Marr would prefer it not be. But if you genuinely decline, I'll pass that along." She got in the car. They drove north, away from the city grid, into a quiet geography of estate roads and old-growth trees and property lines that implied serious money and a preference for privacy. The Suburban turned through an iron gate and up a long gravel drive to a stone house that sat above a lake like it had always been there. Like the lake had arranged itself around the house rather than the other way around. She was led inside by Callum, through a hallway that held more art than most galleries, and left in a study that smelled of wood smoke and old paper and something expensive and amber-colored in a crystal decanter on the sideboard. She had been standing there for less than 2 minutes when the door opened. Vincent Marr had a quality in informal settings that she had not expected. He looked tired. Not weak. She doubted the man had a weak setting, but genuinely, honestly tired, the way that people only look when they've stopped performing for an audience. He was wearing a dark sweater and dark trousers, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was no longer entirely sure why. "Miss Navarro?" he said. "Thank you for coming. I didn't feel strongly that I had a choice," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "You had a choice. Most people in your position would have made a different one." He gestured towards the 2 chairs by the fire. She sat. He poured 2 glasses from the decanter without asking and set one on the table beside her, and she picked it up because her hands needed something to do, and because the whiskey, when she sipped it, was very good. "I had you looked into," he said. "After Thursday, I assumed 11 years in financial analysis. Degree from Georgetown, honors. You've worked for 3 different organizations that were under federal scrutiny during your tenure, and you've never been interviewed, named, or implicated in anything." He sat back in the chair. "That's not luck." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. You know exactly what you see, and you know exactly how much of it to let on that you see." He studied her with the same assessment she'd seen at the dinner table, that calibrated precision, but quieter now. Less threat in it, and more something else she couldn't immediately name. "Tell me what you saw." "The watch came first," Elise said. "Lange & Sone Platinum. He's been wearing it for 6 months. His draw from Holston and the 3 related entities doesn't support that purchase. Either he was saving for it for years, which is possible, people do, or someone gave it to him, or he has an income source I can't see in the books. When did you flag it?" "I didn't. I filed it." He looked at her. "I notice things," she said. "I file them. I don't always know what they're for until later, and Thursday. The phone, the way he was checking it. He was waiting for a confirmation and trying not to look like he was, and then when it came, he relaxed." She paused. Relief before the moment a person should feel relief is a tell. He was relaxed because he thought the risk was almost done. He was treating dinner like it was already over. Marr was quiet for a moment. "My security team has a budget in the mid-7 figures, he said. "And they missed it. Your security team is looking for weapons and surveillance," she said. "They're looking outward." "I was looking at the people at the table." "That's all I do. I look at the people in the room and try to understand what they're not saying." "Why did you warn me?" She had expected this question. She had spent 3 days thinking about how to answer it. "Because you're not entirely monstrous," she said. "And because you said thank you once, and it mattered more than it should have, and I'm apparently not above making decisions based on things that matter more than they should." He looked at her for a long time. The fire crackled outside the windows. The lake was dark and still, and the lights from somewhere across it reflected in long, unsteady lines. I'd like to offer you a different position, Mare said at last. He reached across the desk and picked up a manila folder, opened it, and slid it across the table toward her. Inside was a contract and a check. The check had a lot of numbers on it. This is absurd, she said. That's a signing bonus. The annual figure is on page 2. She looked at page 2. This is also absurd. You'd continue to work in a financial capacity, legitimately. He paused and his voice shifted half a degree, becoming something more careful and more honest. But I'd also like you present at meetings, negotiations, dinners. I want you in the room. She looked up from the contract. Not to carry anything, he said. Not to do anything except what you already do. Sit quietly. Watch. Tell me afterward what you saw. He leaned forward slightly. There are 17 people in my immediate circle. And after Thursday, I don't know which of them I can trust. I have security professionals and lawyers and accountants and advisors. I do not have anyone who does what you do. A pause. I don't think I've ever met anyone who does what you do. What is it that you think I do? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, You make yourself invisible, and then you see everything. You've turned being overlooked into a methodology. The accuracy of it landed somewhere in her chest that she hadn't expected. The people in your world overlook me because of how I look, she said, because I'm fat, and I'm a woman and I work in accounting, and none of that registers as a threat to anyone. It should, he said simply. Thursday proved that conclusively. She looked at the contract. She looked at the check. She thought about her apartment in Lincoln Park, with the good natural light, and the dry cleaners 3 blocks away, and the Thai takeout place that knew her order. She thought about 11 years of keeping her head down, and seeing everything and saying nothing, and what that had given her, which was safety and comfort, and a profound, persistent sense of being on the outside of her own life. She picked up the pen from the table. I'm not carrying a weapon, she said. I know. And I'm not laundering anything. I'll do legitimate books. If the numbers are real, I'll work with them. If they're not, I'll tell you, and you can decide what to do with that. But I'm not the one signing off on anything that will put me in a federal courtroom. Agreed. And you stop calling me Miss Navarro. It makes me feel like someone's about to ask me to schedule a meeting. The tired look shifted. What replaced it was something she hadn't seen on his face before. Something genuine and a little unguarded and entirely unprepared for. He almost smiled. Elise, he said. She signed the contract. The following months were not what she had expected, mostly because she hadn't let herself expect anything specific. She had half prepared for something dark and compromising and morally exhausting. What she got was more complicated. She was right about the utility. Within the first 6 weeks, she flagged a mid-level broker named Prescott, who was negotiating a real estate deal on Mare's behalf, while simultaneously running side conversations with a competing buyer. She caught it from the broker's eye movements during a conference call, the specific way he kept glancing at the camera at precisely the wrong moments, as if checking whether he was being watched rather than tracking the conversation. Ma pulled the deal. Prescott's side arrangement collapsed a week later and ended with a quiet restructuring of relationships that Elise was not present for and did not ask about. She identified a city contracts officer whose body language during a dinner meeting was so stiff and performatively casual that she told Ma afterward the man was almost certainly recording the conversation. Ma called the meeting early on a pretext and had the rooms swept. He was correct. She sat in the corner of rooms where serious things were discussed by serious people, and she drank coffee and turned the pages of folders and looked exactly like what everyone in the room decided she was, which was administrative furniture, and she saw everything. She catalogued. She cross-referenced. She told Mare afterward what she had seen, and he listened with a quality of attention that she had not encountered before in someone with his level of power. Complete, quiet, without interruption or impatience. He listened to her like what she said mattered. Not like it was data to be processed. Like it mattered. The personal shift happened gradually enough that she almost didn't see it, which was ironic given her professional specialty. It started in the late nights. Ma kept strange hours, which she had anticipated, but what she hadn't anticipated was the texture of those hours. The way he would sit across from her in the penthouse study, with takeout containers between them, and talk, not about business, but about the things around business, the city and history and books, and the particular frustrations of managing complicated things in a world that preferred simplicity. He was well-read in a way that surprised her, and funny in a way that surprised her more, dry and precise. And he listened to her opinions with a focus that nobody had directed at her in a professional capacity before, and only rarely in a personal one. She stopped being surprised that she was comfortable around him. She started being suspicious of how comfortable she was. The night it shifted in a way that couldn't be unfiled happened in January, over a contract dispute involving a shipping company in Miami. They had been going over the same 3 documents for 2 hours, and Elise had leaned across the desk to point out a discrepancy in the delivery schedule. And when she straightened up, Mara was looking at her in a way that had nothing to do with the contract. She went very still. "You're doing it again," she said. "Doing what?" "The thing where you look at me like you're deciding something." He set the document down. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had that careful quality that she had come to recognize as him removing the professional register entirely. "Do you know that I've had 3 conversations in the past week that were actually enjoyable? Not productive, not useful. Enjoyable." He paused. "They were all with you. I'm your employee. I'm aware of that. This would be complicated. Most worthwhile things are." She looked at him across the desk with its organized stacks of paper and its lamp pooling light across the surface. She thought about being invisible for 11 years and what it felt like and what it had cost her. She thought about being seen. "I notice things," she said finally. "I've noticed the way you've been talking to me for the last 4 months. And I've been filing it," she said. "I just haven't decided what it means yet." He stood up, and he came around the desk, and he didn't touch her. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the exact quality of his expression, which was something she didn't have a clinical word for, and wasn't sure she needed one. "What would it take," he said quietly, "to move it out of the filing cabinet?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the desk and closed the Miami shipping file. "Dinner," she said. "Not a working dinner, an actual dinner. Somewhere I don't have to take notes." He looked at her with something that had no professional component whatsoever. "Tomorrow," he said. She wore the wine-red blazer. He took her to a restaurant that was not 42 floors above anything, that had a normal front door and a printed menu and no shell companies in its reservation system. And they ate pasta and drank a very good Barolo and talked for 3 hours without discussing a single document. She laughed more than she had in months. He looked at her the way he had across the shipping contracts, except now there was nothing to pretend it was about. They were not a secret for long. The nature of Ma's world meant that things seen by enough people became known, and Elise was at his side often enough that within 2 months, the knowledge was simply present in every room she walked into. The people in his circle, who had initially treated her with the polite indifference extended to staff, recalibrated quickly when they understood what she was to him, and more specifically, when a real estate developer named Forsyth made a comment at a cocktail reception that was dismissive in exactly the wrong way, and Mara turned to look at him with an expression that ended the man's involvement in 3 separate ongoing business arrangements before the evening was over. Nobody made that mistake again. There was a gala in March, held in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, the same building where everything had started. Different floor. The legitimate floor, all marble and chandeliers, and the city's best-dressed people assembled to raise money for a hospital foundation that several of them were on the board of, for reasons that had nothing to do with healthcare. Elise stood in the suite above the street, in a dress she had spent 4 hours selecting, and a final hour convincing herself she was allowed to wear. It was deep sapphire, custom cut to fit her correctly in every dimension, and the tailor, who had been recommended by Mare, with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who considered her being dressed properly a logistics problem worth solving, had made it with a particular architecture of the bodice that made her feel like a building rather than someone attempting to hide inside one. She was adjusting a bracelet when Mara came through the door and stopped. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "Stop," she said. "I haven't said anything." "You have an expression. It's involuntary," he said. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and the look on his face was the most uncomplicated thing she had ever seen from him. A man who was almost never uncomplicated. "You don't say anything that requires me to fix my makeup before we go downstairs." He smiled, the real one, not the professional variation, and offered her his arm. They went downstairs. The ballroom of the Meridian was full. She saw heads turn as they entered. She saw recognition move through the room like a wave. Recognition of Ma, and then the recalibration, the double take. The people who had eaten at tables she'd cleared, or sat in rooms where she'd kept her eyes on her laptop, looking at her now with expressions that had no comfortable place to land. She watched them look, and she stood straight, and she did not look away from any of them, because she had spent too long looking away. A woman in a silver gown approached them with the particular social smile of someone important attempting to appear casual. Ma introduced Elise simply by name, with his hand at the small of her back. "Elise works with me," he said. "She's also the reason I'm still alive. Both of those things are equally true." The woman's smile flickered and recalibrated into something more genuine, and Elise Navarro, who had spent 11 years being the most overlooked person in every room she occupied, stood in the ballroom where the city's most important people assembled, and understood that the work of becoming visible was not losing the invisibility. It was choosing, finally, when to set it down. She didn't need the corner anymore. She had everything she needed, standing exactly where she was.